The Redgate School did not rise quickly. It grew brick by brick from the white crust of salt that covered the flatlands. A new order built on land once drowned and ruined by the floods of 1856. Its founder, a mild-eyed reformer named Jonathan Carr, stood in front of the half-built frame and told the town that children deserved walls that would never bend, roofs that would never leak, and classrooms that would keep silent as their first language. He spoke not with fire but with warmth, a calm tone that promised relief from years of mud, hunger, and washed-out harvests. When the last stone was laid, the townspeople brought candles to the opening, filling the rooms with soft light, and declared it a miracle. They saw hope in the symmetry of the brickwork, in the smooth glass of the windows, in the way every corner seemed measured with care. No one asked what else had been measured. The school stood apart from the town, a square figure against the endless flats, watching without blinking. Inside, its rooms were plain, almost bare. Long wooden desks, black slates, chalk stacked like bones. The walls carried no portraits, no scripture, no slogans. Only silence. Silence was not absence, though, it was presence. A pressure that made every cough or shuffle feel wrong, like breaking a vow. Children and parents alike noticed that silence the first day, but they explained it away. Floods had taken so much that even quiet felt holy, as if stillness could keep disaster away. They believed the building wanted to protect them. They did not see how the building wanted to train them. Jonathan Carr smiled through every inspection. He wore simple linen, ate beside the students, laughed softly when boys cracked their slates. He preached only 3 virtues: neat handwriting, quiet hearts, steady eyes. He told parents that order was kindness, and that chaos was cruelty disguised as freedom. He never raised his voice. He never struck a child. His discipline was gentler and far colder. A trembling hand received extra lessons until the trembling stopped. A restless boy was asked to sit longer until the legs ceased to twitch. A girl who sobbed was praised for her soft voice, then guided to a small room to rest until her chest no longer shook. Parents praised him for his patience. What they did not see was how each lesson removed something unseen from the student, how breathing, moving, even feeling began to fold inward, pressed into shapes the building demanded. The Redgate School was not cruel in the way villagers expected. No whipping post, no rod, no locked closet. Its cruelty was invisible, dressed as care. Each room had a rule hidden in its air. The windows were measured to let light in at angles that wore the eye down by afternoon, forcing heads to bow toward the desk. The floorboards were set with narrow ridges, gentle enough to escape notice, yet sharp enough to mark the skin of any child who shifted too often. The ceilings curved to bend sound, carrying whispers to corners where Jonathan Carr always seemed to stand waiting. Even the chalk dust was chosen, ground with powders that dulled hunger and blurred sleep. The building itself was an instrument, and every visitor played into its design without knowing. The school promised order, and order became worship. Families began to copy its rules at home. Mothers corrected their handwriting in letters. Fathers held breath to steady their signatures. Supper tables grew quieter. The town's children sat straighter in church, blinking less, fidgeting less, their hands folded as if trained by some unseen pulse. What the parents called discipline was something else entirely, an erosion of spirit masked as improvement. The school had not only built walls, it had built expectations. People stopped questioning them. They stopped questioning themselves. Jonathan Carr was always present, yet never central. He walked through classrooms with a hand behind his back, as if listening to something deeper than lessons. He corrected posture with a fingertip, praised restraint, and smiled when a child's hand stilled on the page as if frozen. He carried a small silver watch but never wound it, and students swore they could hear its ticking even when it lay silent in his pocket. Time seemed to move differently under his gaze, slower, heavier, bending days into a pattern that no one could explain. Teachers who came to Redgate marveled at his calm and tried to follow his methods. Each one vanished within a year, replaced quietly by another who copied his steps. The town said they had left for better work. The building did not correct them. The trust of the people was the first lesson. Trust allowed the school to slip deeper, to fold itself into the rhythm of daily life. Trust let Jonathan Carr smile while carrying out what only he understood as the real curriculum. Every brick, every window, every floorboard had been set not for learning but for shaping. The school was not a place of education. It was a design, a living ritual, a silent machine built to see how far a human could be bent without breaking. The parents who lit candles at its opening had no idea they had given those flames to feed something colder than darkness. They had handed their children into a room that listened, breathed, and remembered better than any human mind could. And once trust was given, Redgate never let it go. Seasons turned, floods receded, and the school became a fixture, its brick never stained, its windows never broken. No one thought about how the silence still pressed like a hand on the chest. No one wondered why every teacher who entered seemed to vanish from memory as neatly as chalk erased from slate. The town called Redgate a miracle, and miracles do not invite suspicion. Yet beneath the lesson books and the kind smiles, something else had already begun to write its own order. Something that would not stop with handwriting or quiet hearts. Something that had 12 lessons, none of them spoken aloud. There was another schedule beneath the one pinned to the hallway wall. Parents saw the chalked grid of arithmetic, Latin, penmanship, geography. Each hour accounted for, each subject placed in careful balance. It looked comforting, reliable. But behind that visible order, behind every lesson plan and tidy roll call, a second timetable lived. Not drawn with chalk or ink, but stitched into the rituals of the building itself. This other schedule was not meant for students. It was for the teachers, and no one ever mentioned it aloud. Each academic year began with a quiet hiring. Not all at once, but in a rhythm. One teacher per subject, 1 month after another. Never returning faculty. Always new. It was explained as policy. Fresh minds, fresh methods. Those who left were said to have taken better posts, though no letters were ever read aloud from them. Their names were replaced on the registry in a careful hand. New staff arrived alone. Always unmarried. Always childless. Their rooms were already prepared, modest and spare, with windows facing north so the morning light never touched their beds. On their first morning, each teacher was given a small sheaf of rules printed on brittle cream paper. The ink was faint. The words were gentle. Stillness is strength. Children reflect the breath of the adult. Order begins where self ends. It read like a prayer disguised as instruction. Alongside the rules came a thin book, bound in red twine, no title on the spine. The chapters within held nothing about arithmetic or Latin. Instead, Lesson 1, Observation without Correction. Lesson 4, Preservation of Silence in Self. Lesson 9, Repetitive Control as Contemplation. At the bottom of each page, in small script, the phrase, completion shall be known. No author, no seal. These were the 12 lessons, though no one called them that. They were never discussed during faculty meetings, never spoken of over tea, never questioned. But each teacher learned to follow them. Not because they were told, because something in the building made disobedience feel wrong. Not punished, just wrong. Like stepping out of rhythm with a song you hadn't realized you were singing. Each lesson matched a season. Not calendar seasons, but internal ones. Winter came early for those who fidgeted or asked too many questions. Spring visited those who submitted to long pauses, long silences, and rooms where the children learned not to speak unless beckoned. Summer brought a kind of stillness, a glow behind the eyes, a calm detachment. And autumn was for those who passed. The final lesson came not with applause or recognition, but with a soft knock on the dormitory door and a small cloth envelope. Inside, a bell pin, silver, round, unmarked. The clapper was missing. It made no sound. Those who received one wore it on the inside of their collar. They didn't smile. They simply became quieter. The test was never declared. It wasn't about grades or discipline. It was about how deeply a teacher could surrender voice, thought, breath, until nothing of their old self remained. Until the school had them fully. And some passed with chilling ease. Failure left no mark, no punishment, no warning, only absence. A desk cleared without announcement. A name no longer listed, their students assigned elsewhere. The staff room quieter by one. And when someone asked, rarely and never twice, they were told the teacher had returned home due to illness. No one ever saw where the bodies went, if there were any. Perhaps the school took something else instead. It was not a cult, not in any way outsiders would recognize. It was order. Order made absolute, and Jonathan Carr watched it unfold with quiet satisfaction. He never taught the lessons himself. He never distributed the pins, but his presence sharpened with each one given. He stood straighter, blinked less. His hands folded with even more precision behind his back. He was not the instructor. He was the keeper of the design. Somewhere between the third and fourth lesson, new teachers began to forget small things. Names, birthdays, whether they had written letters home, whether anyone was still expecting them. They stopped thinking in questions. They moved with fluidity, not because they were trained, but because the walls had taught them how to move. Each floorboard, each breath of cold air from the vents, reinforced a pattern of behavior that felt correct in the bones. By the time they reached the ninth lesson, repetitive control is contemplation. Many could sit for hours in complete stillness while children recited lines in hushed tones. The teachers no longer corrected posture. They emanated it. They no longer told students to quiet down. Their very presence swallowed sound. One instructor stared out the window so long during recess that frost bloomed on the inside of the glass. He didn't notice. The lesson had taken root. Not every teacher reached the end. Some broke early, curled in bed with hollow eyes. Some vanished with the dawn. And some passed, though past meant only that the school had accepted their breath, their patience, their silence. They were not praised. They were repurposed. The final lesson taught no new skill. It was only acceptance. Acceptance that the self was noise. That to remove it was mercy. That a teacher was not a person but a vessel. One pen, one season, one lesson at a time. The 12 were never written on the walls, never listed in any book. But they lived in the breath of every corridor, in the hush of every closed door, in the steps that never echoed once mastered. And once the teachers were emptied, once the pins had been quietly delivered and the self dissolved, the next stage began. Not in word, but in rhythm. The music room waited, and its first rule was simple. Breathe only when the bell allows. The music room at Redgate did not sound like other rooms. It breathed, not in the fanciful way people say a building comes alive, but in a literal, structured way. Each board, each beam, each ceiling curve shaped to hold and return sound like the inside of a vast throat. Brass bells hung from above, varying in size, pitch, and resonance. Most did not ring unless summoned by the wind from the flues, but even when still, they shaped the silence into something thick and slow. When a child entered the room, their lungs adjusted. Shallow breaths grew deeper. Quick gasps slowed. Without knowing, they matched themselves to the room. The room never matched them. It began with humming. Not from instruments, but from the walls themselves. A low, constant tone, too faint to notice consciously, yet impossible to ignore once it was gone. It vibrated through the benches and floorboards, a warm tension that drew breath into rhythm. No metronome was ever struck. No commands were given. The children were simply asked to hum, softly and together. At first the sounds clashed and trembled, but within moments all voices folded into the same slow, steady wave. And when they did, the humming ceased. Not because it had ended, but because the room no longer needed to carry it. The children were doing it now. The room had taught them how. The instructor for music was always new. No one knew her name. She wore a green wool shawl and never removed her gloves. She rarely raised her voice, but when she did, It was in perfect pitch, precise and cold, as if she had tuned herself to the bells above. Her teaching was simple. No notes, no theory, only breath. Inhale when the bell sounds, exhale when it stops. Let the rhythm enter you. Let it erase hesitation. Let it erase self. The children were told that control of the breath was control of the soul. That stillness began in the lungs. That the body's noise, its fear, its panic, its joy could all be silenced with proper rhythm. Under the choir risers sat a small wooden stall. It was not used for performance. It was narrow, lined with thick felt and dark oak, and always smelled faintly of salt and cold brass. It had no windows. A single slit in the wall allowed air to enter, but only when the bell above it moved. A child chosen for private instruction would be led into the stall with a smile and a word of praise. They were told it was an honor, that their breath was almost perfect, that they needed just a little more time to master it. Inside, they were asked to match the bell's rhythm. Inhale as it rang, exhale when it fell quiet. The bell chose the pace, and the bell never forgot. The pace changed daily. Sometimes the intervals were long, pushing the lungs to their edge, pulling breath like water from a deep well. Other times they came quickly, demanding surrender to rhythm over thought. The stall had no lock. The child could leave whenever they wanted, but most did not. Most stayed until the bell allowed them to breathe freely again. And each time they returned to class, they spoke less, moved slower, smiled in quiet, glassy ways. They sang in perfect time. They breathed without sound. They were praised for their discipline. One girl, Clara White, sang better than anyone. Her voice was soft but clear, unwavering in pitch. Even when asked to hum through tears, she was sent to the stall more than once. She stayed longer each time. Eventually, she could hum for nearly 2 minutes without visible strain. Her classmates whispered that she didn't blink during songs, that her chest didn't rise, that she didn't breathe at all unless the bell permitted it. Then one day, she was excused from rehearsal early and never returned. Her bed was made, her clothes folded. The shawl she always wore was gone. No explanation was offered. A substitute was placed in her desk the next morning. The choir sang better that week. The instructor said nothing. Jonathan Carr would often pause outside the music room. He never entered. He would tilt his head slightly as if checking the tempo of a heartbeat. Then he would move on, satisfied. He never acknowledged the stall, never commented on the bells. But the way he walked past, slow, centered, breath held just slightly, spoke of deep familiarity. He had designed the space not with instruments but with control in mind. He understood that breath was not just life but will, that to master it was to begin erasing the person from within. The children were learning. So were the teachers. Over time, the breathing of the entire school began to shift. Assemblies grew quieter. Recess grew shorter. Students walked the halls in near silence, not out of fear, but because noise felt wrong. Lungs moved slower. Chests rose in unison. Even laughter, when it came, carried the strange cadence of rehearsed permission. And in the evenings, long after the lessons ended, the bells in the music room rang faintly as if reminding the building of its own heartbeat. The walls remembered every breath taken within them, and they never forgot who had failed to follow the rhythm. Soon, students were being prescribed short visits to the music room for emotional imbalance or fidgeting. Their schedules adjusted silently, so parents never noticed. They came back calmer. They came back quiet. The system deepened its hold, one inhale, one exhale at a time. The body was no longer an instrument. It was a metronome waiting to be set. And when the lungs no longer disobeyed, when the breath no longer resisted, the school introduced its next lesson. Something for the hands. Something to steady what still trembled. The ink room waited warm and sharp, and inside it a tonic was being prepared. Not for sickness, not for clarity, but for stillness. Because even a perfect breath meant nothing if the hand betrayed a quiver. The penmanship master at Redgate was a man no one saw arrive, and no one watched leave. His name was never printed on the staff lists, yet his presence was constant, like the smell of ink in the halls, iron-heavy, sweet, and slightly metallic. He was tall, skeletal in posture, with collar buttons always fastened and cuffs that never bore a single mark. Even among the staff who had already learned the value of restraint, he moved with a level of precision that unnerved. His hands never shook, not once. He was the only instructor allowed to speak during faculty silence, and even then, only in brief, clipped instructions. Straighter, smaller, no hesitation. He did not teach handwriting. He taught submission through lines. When new staff arrived, they were taken to him on their third day, always the third. Not earlier, not later. The visit was not announced as training. It was called clarification. The penmanship master would greet them in the ink room, a narrow chamber near the boiler, where the air hung heavy with fumes that blurred vision and numbed the nose. The first thing he offered was the tonic. It came in a glass so thin it clicked when set down. The liquid was black as pitch with a smell like overripe fruit and old coins. He called it a clarifier, said it steadied the nerves, stilled the breath, and brought the hand into obedience. He watched them drink. He never drank it himself. The effects were immediate and subtle. The pulse slowed. Sight sharpened at first, edges became cleaner, shadows deeper. But most of all, the tremble stopped. Fingers grew steady. Even thoughts seemed to flatten into a soft, manageable rhythm. There was no fear, only a spreading warmth that settled behind the eyes and whispered that everything now would be correct. The tonic was not mandatory, but no one refused it twice. Those who abstained found their handwriting marked by red circles the next day. Their evaluations dropped. Their lessons shortened. Eventually they drank. All of them. The ink itself was made in vats. 3 copper cauldrons set on brick risers, each stirred by hand with paddles that hissed when lifted. The ink's base was gallnut and iron salt, but the penmanship master added something else. No one knew what. The mixture fumed constantly, even when cooled. The vapor coated everything. It stained teeth a grayish hue, left a taste like iron filings on the tongue, and made the throat feel lined with wax. It also made the ink permanent, not just on paper, but on memory. Once a letter was written in it, it could not be unwritten from the hand. Even blindfolded, the writer could trace the line again perfectly. Muscle remembered. The line became law. Students trained on smaller amounts. Teachers were given the full strength. After weeks in the ink room, they began to write without drafts. They wrote without hesitation. But something else happened too. The longer one used the ink, the harder it became to tell where a letter ended. Lines blurred at the edges. The hand did not feel the end of the page. Some wrote past the margins onto the desk. Some wrote onto their own arms, still believing it was paper. The ink never faded. It stayed black and deep, like it had sunk below the skin. The penmanship master never commented on this. He only adjusted posture and made note of progress in a ledger that had no dates. One teacher, a woman known for her poetic flourishes, began signing her name with smaller and smaller loops until the letters became a single thin blade. Another teacher stopped using their name entirely, signing only with a straight line that trembled with energy, as if it had not been drawn, but cut. The tonic deepened its effect with repetition. Hands became colder, movements more exact, but emotion drained from the page. Praise notes to students began to sound like eulogies. Lesson plans read like binding contracts. The words were perfect. Deadly perfect. The ink room had no clock. Lessons there ended only when the penmanship master closed his book and said, "That will do." Those who resisted the tonic began to feel phantom pulses in their fingers, tiny stings, like corrections being written directly onto their bones. Some staff wore gloves outside class. Some stopped eating with forks. The hand no longer belonged to them. It obeyed the ink. Students noticed too. Some began to mimic the staff without being told. Their handwriting grew smaller, rounder, quieter. They folded notes without creases. They erased without smudges. A few began to dip their pens even when no ink remained. They wrote anyway. The motion mattered more than the mark. Jonathan Carr reviewed writing samples once a month. He said nothing, but his eyes lingered longer on the ones without error, the ones written in silence and finished without pause. He never commented on the tonic, never entered the ink room. But the vats were filled weekly, without shipment or delivery, as if something below the building made its own supply. One winter morning, a staff member was found in their quarters, hand locked into a writing pose, knuckles frozen in place. The slate beside them read only one word again and again: correct. No investigation followed. The penmanship master merely asked for the desk to be cleared. The tonic was given to another instructor that evening. A new ledger page began, and so the ink did its work, not through violence or command, but through precision. It consumed hesitation. It removed self. It whispered that flaw was noise and silence was truth. It made the body a conduit, not a creator. After enough sessions, the hand no longer needed the mind to write. It responded to rhythm, to air pressure, to heat. And so the next lesson arrived not through sound or ink, but through temperature. In the chambers below the school, something colder than frost waited. Not as punishment, as refinement. Because after breath and hand, it was time to train the skin. Beneath the Redgate School's southern wing, behind a latched panel mistaken for coal storage, lay a chamber that defied the season. Even in July, when the air above shimmered with heat and flies circled the dried salt flats outside, the room below held frost along its beams. They called it the still room. Officially, it was a space for correction, first for students, then later for staff, but no one used the word punishment. It was discipline, then therapy, then finally nothing at all. It simply became part of the structure, like a lung that exhaled cold in place of sound. Inside, the temperature was not freezing in the way of winter. It was deliberate, controlled. The cold did not bite, it extracted. The walls were lined with copper piping and iron trays filled with brine and powdered sal ammoniac, a formula long banned in public institutions but retained here under the guise of experimental atmospheric control. There were no stoves, no flames. The cold came from reaction, from the precise balance of substance and time. It worked slowly, it seeped. The floor iced first, thin sheets that mirrored the overhead beams. Then came the frost on wooden benches, spreading in slow veins. At its coldest, the room drew heat from skin without raising a welt. No frostbite, no injury, just a steady siphoning of warmth that left a person shivering long after they left. Staff were introduced to the still room under the pretense of resilience training. They were asked to sit silently for the length of a hymn, palms placed flat on their knees, breath measured. The hymn was played from a wax cylinder that crackled and wavered, always the same one, a slow minor dirge with no lyrics, only humming. The first time felt like a test of patience. The second like a quiet unraveling. By the third session, no one dared resist. The silence grew thick. Thoughts slowed. Even fear dimmed. The body's trembling was not discouraged. It was observed. The penmanship master recorded each session in a gray ledger, noting pulse changes, color loss, the exact time before shoulders drooped and eyes unfocused. The cold did not merely numb, it rearranged. One teacher, a man known for impatience, emerged from his fourth session with his voice lowered by half. Not hoarse, reduced, as though the cold had taken part of it. He never raised it again. Another instructor lost track of time during her sixth session. When asked how long she had sat, she said she hadn't been sitting at all. She said she had been flattening. That word was written down, though no one explained what it meant. Students were later told that the still room helped correct overexcitement. It was introduced into the curriculum without fanfare. Misbehavior led to temperature reflection, a phrase that quickly lost its meaning and gained obedience. The child was led in, seated, and told to breathe slowly. The bell from the music room sometimes played overhead, syncing breath with the hum. No restraints were needed. The room did the work. 10 minutes reduced tantrums to silence. 20 erased defiance for weeks. One child, known for outbursts, returned from a 30-minute session unable to speak for 2 days. When his voice came back, it was polite, measured. His breath steamed longer than the others. No injuries, no bruises, no complaint. The brilliance of the room lay in its lack of violence. Pain had no place here, only subtraction. Each session pulled away something: heat, resistance, memory of defiance. The cold filled that space with stillness. It was impossible to prove what had changed, and so no one tried. Jonathan Carr never entered the room during operation, but his signature approved every material order: salt blocks, acid jars, copper sheeting. His handwriting curved with perfect loops across each requisition slip. He watched the door often. He lingered as staff emerged, eyes glazed, cheeks colorless. He would nod slightly, not as praise, but as confirmation. They had made progress. There was a philosophy to the cold, a quiet, precise logic. Heat was disorder. Heat carried rage, confusion, the fever of thought. The still room did not punish. It corrected. It whispered that warmth was indulgence, and indulgence was noise. By removing heat, it removed the need for disobedience. After the breath and the hand had been trained, the body itself had to be addressed. The skin could still react, still twitch, still resist. Cold taught it otherwise. Some claimed the room had moods, that its chill varied with who entered, that those closest to passing the 12 lessons felt less cold, that the building itself recognized discipline. One teacher swore the air grew warmer the longer she sat still, as though the room approved. Another said he heard a second breath beneath his own, slower, larger, echoing in the vents. No one doubted them. At Redgate, even the absurd could feel reasonable when it arrived quietly. The cold became a measure. Students with the highest discipline were permitted longer sessions. Some requested it without being told. Others stayed inside after the music ended. Not asleep, not frozen, just quiet. One girl walked out after nearly an hour, cheeks pale, tears frozen on her chin. When asked what she had learned, she whispered, "Stillness means I'm clean." That phrase became part of the staff guide the following year. It was added in red ink. Soon no one questioned the room. It simply became another lesson. The air shifted slightly as one passed it in the corridor, a breath colder than the rest of the hall. Teachers unconsciously matched their pace to its pressure. Children lowered their voices near its door. And below the frost, below the brick, the building recorded every minute of silence, every moment the cold won. As discipline became geography, as order mapped itself onto skin and movement, the school's true design unfolded. Not just in breath or posture or silence, but in space. Redgate was not just a building. It was a map. And it had begun to sort its occupants accordingly. Redgate's classrooms were built on more than wood and brick. Beneath the scuffed floorboards and lacquered pine sat a second design, one not shown in blueprints or described in any construction log. It was known only to a few and understood by fewer still. Below the classrooms, under the boards and joists, lay a vast grid of salt lines, iron nails, and chalk-scored angles. A map not of the world outside, but of an imagined one. This hidden floor was set to its own system of meridians, drawn not from any globe, but from the mind of Jonathan Carr. Each intersection, each nail, each measured stretch of threadbare cord represented a place the school would never visit. Towns that did not exist. Seas without coast, cities with no language. Their names were carved into the subfloor in reverse, meant to be read only by someone crawling beneath, someone meant to understand their arrangement from below. Above it all, the room sat silent. The children moved in straight rows, their desks anchored to points that corresponded with something unseen. When the school was still, when the last bell had rung and the final slate erased, faint tremors passed through the floorboards. not from below but from within the wood itself, as if the grain remembered too much. New teachers were introduced to the map without being told what it was. During orientation, they were asked to pace the rooms in specific paths, to improve presence, Carr would say, to attune the body to space. The paths were carefully measured, marked with chalk that vanished by noon, but left a pressure in the joints. Teachers walked the lines with books balanced on their palms or with eyes closed and steps counted. They turned at exact corners, paused on exact slats, and resumed without questioning why. After a week, the pacing became habit. The body knew where to turn before the mind remembered why. Some noticed changes, headaches that followed certain turns, heat behind the eyes at specific intersections. One teacher found his fingers tingling when he stepped too far west in room 3. Another dreamed of ocean tides whenever she stood near the back corner of the East Hall. These experiences were not discussed. They were treated like fainting spells or sleepwalking, strange, harmless things that passed if ignored. But the body remembered. The bones remembered. The pacing paths carved channels through thought until even rest felt like motion. Each classroom held a square that Carr never explained. To the unknowing eye, it was just another worn spot in the floor, perhaps scuffed more than others, perhaps a bit darker in color. But if one stood over it for long, they would smell something impossible. Rain. Even in drought, even in the thickest dust summer, the air above that square held the scent of a storm just past. Not ozone, not rot. Something else. Freshness turned wrong, clarity tainted by something sour underneath. Teachers who stepped on the square during their pacing drills reported dizziness, brief vertigo, and later, forgetting where the day had gone. It was not marked on the map below, and yet it sat at its exact center. The iron nails surrounding it were driven deeper than the rest. The salt lines intersected there and burned away faster than anywhere else. That square the children came to call the rain spot. They joked about it softly, never touching it. One child placed a beetle on it once. The insect trembled and curled, as if winter had dropped on it from nowhere. It died without mark, without struggle, as if it had been uninvited from life. The class was moved to a different room the following day. The purpose of the grid was never spoken aloud. But the staff who passed the later lessons began to understand. Space was not neutral. Movement within space defined thought. Just as breath could be trained, just as the hand could be stilled, so too could location be weaponized. Not through threat, but through design. Each step mattered. Each pause signaled intention. Carr believed that to master environment was to master the body, and the school's environment had been built to think on its own. At night, when the halls were empty and even the copper pipes below had cooled, something subtle changed in the way dust settled. Teachers reported waking with traces of chalk on their shoes, though they hadn't entered a classroom in days. Footprints appeared and vanished. The janitor avoided mopping certain stretches of floor, saying only that the water refused to dry there. And under every desk, the knots of the wood floor shifted ever so slightly, aligning like compass needles, always pointing back to the rain spot. Children began walking in patterns, uncoached. At recess, they traced invisible paths into the dirt, concentric loops repeating triangles. One group began a game where they had to reach the far wall in exactly 72 steps. If they took more or fewer, they had to start over. No one had taught them this rule. It had simply arrived. The map was being remembered through bodies, not minds. The school had stopped teaching subjects. It was now teaching placement. By the time teachers realized how the grid shaped behavior, they were already part of it. Their pacing steps matched the rhythm of the bells. Their fingers twitched to invisible coordinates. One instructor stood motionless for hours during an inspection, claiming she could hear the nails humming beneath the floorboards. She was moved to administrative duties. Her replacement vanished within a month. The map did not require belief. It required obedience. It needed presence, weight, warmth, and return. Those who gave themselves to its paths were rewarded with clarity, silence, and stillness. Those who resisted simply stopped returning. No record, no farewell, just a name unspoken and a desk reassigned. Redgate no longer taught geography. Geography taught Redgate. Space was now an extension of control, a system of lines and positions, of pulses measured in footsteps. And so the next subject was not space but time, because to own the hand, the breath, and the path was not enough. Now the school would take the pulse, and arithmetic would teach it how. There was a clock on the west wall of every Redgate classroom, but none louder than the one in room 8. It did not tick with urgency. Its rhythm was slow and patient, like a kind nurse tapping her knuckles against wood to remind a child to breathe. It never stopped. Its pendulum, long and brass, swung in a near-silent arc, but the click, soft and deep, punctuated every moment. It was not just a marker of time. It was a teacher, and the lesson was submission. Each tick was measured at a precise interval, 70 beats per minute, slow enough to comfort, slow enough to correct. The sound was not intrusive. It was ambient, nestling into the folds of thought until no one noticed it anymore. But it never left. Over time, the students began to shift their posture on the beat. Teachers paused between words to match it. Coughs and footsteps began to fall in rhythm. The clock did not control them. It tuned them. Beneath the desks, hidden by thin slats of polished oak, lay copper sheets wired to small Leyden jars, early capacitors, archaic in design but refined in execution. These were part of what Carr called focus games, introduced without explanation during a staff meeting no one remembered requesting. The jars stored tiny charges, delivered not to punish but to guide. The game was simple. Place the fingers lightly on the copper sheet, wait for the click of the clock, lift on the next. Touch, hold, release. Touch, hold, release. When done correctly, no charge was felt. But if the fingers drifted out of sync, too slow, too fast, the circuit closed and a soft pulse vibrated into the skin. Not pain, just correction, a reminder to return. At first, children laughed nervously when they felt it. Some flinched. But the charge was never strong enough to frighten, only to reframe attention. Over weeks, laughter faded. Hands grew steadier. One girl wrote an entire essay in perfect cursive without once lifting her pen outside the tick's rhythm. The pulse had become part of her. The heart learned from the hand. The beat sank into the bloodstream. Teachers were given more advanced versions. Their jars were tuned to different intervals, slower for those who rushed, quicker for those prone to drift. During meetings, some would place their palms flat on the copper edge of the table, absorbing the rhythm unconsciously. Eventually, it replaced their inner clock. Meals were taken in rhythm. Steps in the hallway matched the pulse. Even blinking began to space itself between ticks. Jonathan Carr had introduced the number engine, not as a device, but as a concept. He explained it as a discipline of internal alignment, to bring the body into mathematical order. It was never described as control. The language remained soft, clinical, gracious, but the results were clear. One by one, the children learned to breathe not when they needed, but when the beat allowed. Teachers learned to think only between pulses. Emotion became a variable that could be paused. Some said the rhythm followed them home, that the pulse echoed faintly even when away from school. One child refused to sleep without a ticking clock nearby. Another panicked when his family's mantle clock skipped a beat. He claimed he couldn't breathe correctly without the proper sound. He sat awake that night, tapping his chest in the dark, trying to summon the lost rhythm. The most disciplined students no longer reacted to disruption. Loud noises, shouted commands, even sudden cold did not startle them. Their pupils did not dilate. Their breathing did not spike. One boy watched a stray dog attack another child during recess and did not blink. He stood exactly still, hands folded, waiting for the next lesson. When asked why, he said, "It wasn't my turn to move." That was the quiet horror of the number engine. It did not kill emotion. It buried it under structure. The human responses, fear, excitement, sadness, were still there but muffled. Filtered through the beat. When a teacher announced her father had died, the class fell into a soft hum, 12 voices low and synchronized. No one told them to. They simply knew. The clock clicked on. In the dormitories, the rhythm remained. Children dreamt in patterns. Some counted their own breaths as they slept. Others spoke in clipped phrases upon waking, words spaced as though marked by some hidden metronome. The Leyden jars were removed over summer breaks but reinstated each fall, always with slightly adjusted timing. Just enough to create discomfort, just enough to remind the body it was still being trained. One morning, a teacher who had passed all 12 lessons climbed the south stairs, her hands full of attendance slips. She reached the top step, paused, and realized her heart was still beating at the classroom tempo. It had not sped up, not even slightly. No breathless climb, no spike of effort. Even more unsettling, she noticed her thoughts were arriving on the beat, 1 per second, measured, spaced, hollow. She was no longer thinking. She was calculating. Later that month, she collapsed at her desk, not from illness but from stillness. Her heart had not stopped. It had simply ceased to vary. No rhythm shift for effort, fear, or sleep. She had become a clock herself. The body adapted to the beat so completely it forgot how to respond to life. She was revived and sent to rest. She returned with paler skin and no memory of the event. But her footsteps remained perfect. Carr had always maintained that control should feel like comfort. That the best discipline was invisible, automatic, gentle. The number engine proved him right. The staff had stopped asking questions. The children stopped crying. The beat did not suppress chaos. It replaced it with sequence. And in that quiet sequence, the school found perfect order. But while the halls clicked in rhythm and hearts ticked in harmony, Redgate showed a different face to the world outside. A softer one. Letters home praised the children's progress. Donors were thanked. Visitors welcomed. Because even a machine as precise as Redgate needed a mask, and that mask wore kindness. Redgate's cruelty never raised its voice. It never shouted or struck. It smiled, it held doors open. It thanked you for your patience. Parents received letters written in immaculate cursive, letters that praised the children's progress, gently asked for trust, and explained away absences or unusual behavior with phrases like minor academic fatigue or temporary nervous temperament, not uncommon among new staff adjusting to Redgate's unique rhythms. The ink never smudged. The words never accused. Each letter folded itself like a blessing, warm in tone, empty in truth. The correspondence always arrived at dusk, carried by a single boy with clean boots and a sealed satchel. Inside, each family received their own version of the truth. If a child had stopped speaking, it was described as a reflective developmental phase. If a teacher vanished mid-term, they were said to be pursuing personal growth opportunities elsewhere. No one in town challenged the wording. It felt rude to question such well-mannered explanations, and that was the brilliance of it. The school disarmed suspicion not through fear but through politeness. Suspicion requires friction. Redgate left none. Parents were invited monthly to open room sessions where children read passages aloud. Slow, precise, emotionless recitations of texts chosen for their moral clarity. Visitors called them moving, clean. Some even cried, not because the words were powerful, but because the silence between each sentence felt so heavy, so full of control, that it seemed like the children were reciting from the edge of something holy. Donors attended in velvet gloves and pinned brooches. They were served tea in porcelain cups that never chipped. They marveled at how still the children sat, how quiet the halls were, how calm. The headmaster, Jonathan Carr, made house calls when needed. He visited sick children with folded hands and a soft jar of broth. He praised mothers for their sacrifices. He complimented fathers on their strong handwriting, their orderly homes. His voice was never loud. It never needed to be. He soothed. He remembered names. He said things like, "Children flourish under gentle constancy." He brought books as gifts, always the same volume, bound in black with no author named. Parents placed them on mantels never opened. They were too beautiful to touch. Inside the school, the illusion was preserved by the laundress. She was not part of the teaching staff, yet her role was central. She maintained every uniform, every apron, every slip of cloth that might suggest something other than cleanliness. But her most important task was not laundry. It was editing. Every week she collected notes from teachers, private evaluations, discipline forms, internal letters, and she rewrote them. Not changed. Rewritten. Harsh comments were softened. Anger became concern. Fear became caution. Her penmanship was flawless. Her ink, the same as that used in the school's public announcements. Her revisions were filed as originals. The original words were burned in the stove behind the linen wall. Not a single piece was ever retrieved. Children who had bitten, screamed, or collapsed were described as momentarily untethered from routine. Teachers who wept in corners were listed as undergoing structured recalibration. There were no breakdowns, only shifts in alignment. There were no punishments, only pauses in instruction. The words did not lie directly. They removed the language needed to understand what was truly happening. And once the language was gone, perception followed. Parents began to mimic the tone. Letters home became gentler, more formal. Mothers corrected each other's phrasing at market. Fathers folded their newspaper edges in perfect thirds. Even illness was renamed. He's not ill, just weathered. She's not sad, only thoughtful. The community began to speak like the school. Careful, calm, correct. Photographs of students were staged twice a year. Children posed with books in hand, backlit by windows that made their faces glow. No one ever smiled too widely. The photographer, a quiet man with thick lenses, always adjusted their posture with light taps. Lift the chin, lower the eyes, quiet the mouth. The images were mailed to families in cream envelopes tied with thread. They showed health, discipline, pride. No one noticed how the children all tilted slightly left, as if following an unseen line. When rumors did surface, whispers of fatigue, of children who no longer laughed, of staff who hadn't been seen outside in weeks, the school responded not with denial but with generosity. Bread was delivered to homes with sick elders. Tuition fees were quietly waived for widows. The school choir performed at funerals, their voices hushed and angelic. No one could stay angry at something so kind. Carr understood the nature of suspicion. It feeds on aggression. It shrinks before grace, and so Redgate wore grace like armor. The children's clothes were pressed. The curtains laundered weekly. Even the ink blots in the practice books seemed placed rather than spilled. A building that presents as perfect is not accused. It is envied. Inside the staff rooms, however, the quiet deepened. Teachers stopped meeting in pairs. Meals were taken alone, trays perfectly arranged. When someone cried, it happened in private and only once. The culture of kindness was absolute. But beneath it was hollowness, a vacuum where outrage might once have lived. One visitor, a former inspector, wrote in his journal that Redgate was the most peaceful institution he'd ever encountered. He noted the impeccable manners of the children, the stillness of the air, the way even the birds seemed to avoid the grounds, as if out of respect. He closed with a line that no one ever read. It's as if something else is breathing for them now. And in truth, something was. But it didn't breathe in lungs or lie in beds. It was the building itself. It fed on politeness. It strengthened through courtesy. Its protection was charm. And its secrets were never locked behind doors. They were buried in paperwork, smoothed by ink, and filed in places no one would think to look. Because the records that mattered, the real ones, were not kept in ledgers or drawers. They were scattered, hidden, reshaped into objects meant to distract. And that's where the next layer of Redgate's memory lived. Not in what was written, but in what disguised itself as something else entirely. The janitor at Redgate was older than the building, or so the children believed. He moved with a slowness that never seemed lazy, just deliberate, like he was keeping time with something deeper than footsteps. His back was bent, his boots scuffed smooth, his coat always buttoned to the throat even in the heat. No one remembered when he'd been hired. He was simply always there, sweeping, oiling hinges, replacing knobs before they could even rattle. And when he moved through the halls, the silence seemed to part for him. As if the building knew he was its equal. He never raised his voice, never answered questions with more than a nod or a soft grunt. Teachers called him sir without irony, and students avoided his path without instruction. But it wasn't fear. It was something older. Respect, maybe, or recognition. That he was not staff, not family, but function. He carried with him a small book, bound in cracked leather, soft at the corners, marked with soot thumbprints. He wrote in it with a carpenter's pencil-shaved blunt, never sharpened. Each line was brief, never crossed out. The pages smelled of oil and mold. If anyone ever looked inside, they would have seen no names, no times, no complaints. Just phrases that read more like liturgy than maintenance. Draft sealed behind room 2. Hymn echo reduced. Second hum corrected. West wing. Salt line rescored, mild erosion. Stain paired to compliance. Lesson complete. Bell retained. The last entry always read the same way after certain dates. Always in the same ink. Always 3 words. Lesson complete. Bell retained. He never explained what the phrases meant. He submitted no copies to administration. Yet no task went undone. Leaks dried. Rot disappeared. Warped doors rehung themselves, it seemed, without sound. Teachers assumed he was assigned by the county. The county assumed he was part of the founding staff. No one knew his pay. He never missed a day. Sometimes students claimed they saw him standing still in the empty classrooms at night, holding a candle near the walls, whispering to them in a tongue they couldn't place. Others said he hummed to the floor before nailing it shut. One boy watched him tap each stair with a brass rod before oiling the railing. When asked what he was doing, the man looked up and said, "Counting breath," then returned to work. He did not teach, but his ledger shaped more than any curriculum. It was not a record of what was broken. It was a ritual of confirmation, that the building had been kept pure, that its rhythm had not slipped. When a lesson ended, he did not evaluate, he sealed, with brine or wax or silence. After many decades, the school closed suddenly, citing low enrollment and building fatigue. The townspeople were told the roof could not be saved. They did not protest. By then, the name Redgate had faded into a kind of polite unease, a memory everyone kept beneath thicker memories. The school was locked, its windows boarded, the grounds left to salt and weeds. Years passed, then decades more. And then one winter, a county clerk cataloging abandoned properties came across a pile of old books in a condemned chapel storage room. Water-damaged Bibles, hymnals, teaching manuals. One was heavier than it should have been. Its spine, when sliced open for preservation, held something else entirely. A second book, stitched into the Bible's back with gut thread, hidden between verses. It was the janitor's ledger. The clerk scanned the entries with mild confusion. What were hums and stains paired? Why no names? Why no months? But curiosity turned to unease as the entries shifted. The clerk, trained to track civic records, noticed the frequency of one phrase, lesson complete, bell retained, and its eerie pattern. Each instance aligned precisely with years when Redgate staff records listed no departure, but photos showed fewer faces. No resignation, no transfer, just absence. He matched the dates across teacher rosters, building reports, and photographs donated to the county archive. The ledger did not miss. Every disappearance had been accompanied by a lesson and the retention of a bell. What bell? There were no church bells in the school. No records of installations or removals. Yet one phrase returned again and again with cold finality. Bell retained. The clerk filed a quiet report. No action was taken. The pages were copied, rebound, then quietly misplaced. But not forgotten, because what the clerk saw, what he could not explain, was that the janitor had never named a single person. Only tasks. Only conditions. The human cost was never noted, just the adjustment made. The stain corrected. The rhythm restored. The ledger wasn't a repair log. It was a confession, or worse, a record of obedience. By then, no one could find the man. No obituary, no tax form, no grave. He had left only the record, and even that had tried to hide itself. Yet Redgate still stood, weather-beaten, crooked now at the eaves, but standing. And the door, when unlocked for a structural review decades later, opened without protest. The hinges did not squeal. The rooms were clean of dust, the air cold but dry, the furniture undisturbed. It was as though someone had swept just hours before. What remained inside was not vandalism or decay. It was waiting. The town sent a team to investigate formally. Historians, preservationists, builders, ordinary people with clipboards and careful steps. They carried pens, flashlights, test kits. But they brought something the building had never truly known: doubt. For the first time in nearly a century, the town entered the walls it once trusted. The same walls that hummed, bled ink, took breath, stole heat, and taught rhythm. They came not with reverence but with suspicion, and the building remembered. It started with rain. A real rain. Not the kind that left soft drizzle on window panes, but a week-long flood that churned the fields and pulled at the roots of the salt flats like fingers clawing through paper. The old drainage channels groaned under the pressure. The bricks of Redgate, which had once been laid with such precise balance, began to shift. One corner of the south wing sagged by less than an inch, but it was enough. Behind the boiler house, the ground collapsed into a shallow sink, and with it came a low groan that should not have come from wood. It was the sound of something loosening, something long held tight. When the rain stopped, the townspeople came not to mourn damage but to see what had been uncovered. They found beneath the foundation stones a narrow crawl space, too small to store anything useful, too wide to be accidental. Inside hung 12 bells from rust-black chains, each spaced exactly 7 feet apart. They were not wired. They bore no ropes. They had never rung in the halls above. Dustless and untouched, they hung in a silence that pressed against the skin like cold breath. Their shape was wrong. Not round and wide, but narrow, with long throats and mouths pinched like closed fists. The kind of bells meant not to call, but to keep. The town said nothing for several hours. Then the digging began. Work crews, volunteers, old students, some curious, some angry, some quiet, began to lift the polished floorboards, long praised for their durability. Beneath them, the first things they found were the frost-burned planks. They came up in shards, their edges softened like driftwood. One section peeled upward with a sharp hiss of steam, revealing a layer of blackened brine and coils of copper that had gone green with age. The floor had been alive in its own way. Warm, reactive, designed to feel solid while pulling heat downward. That heat had not dissipated. It had been taken. Further into the west wing, they opened a patch of ground near the music room and found ink-wet clay beneath the joists. It bled slowly when touched, a thick terry seep that smelled faintly sweet like fruit gone too long beneath the sun. One woman touched it with her bare palm and drew back as if burned, whispering that her fingers tasted like metal now. The clay resisted shovels. It stuck to tools and stained gloves and pulled in threads, as if still trying to write something in the dark. In the classrooms, they lifted entire desk rows and found the nail grid below, iron rusted to blood red, salt lines now thin and broken in places but still visible. The map beneath the rooms had not faded. It had grown tighter, more detailed, shifting slightly to follow the body's weight. Those who stood too long above it reported nausea, pressure in the teeth, and memories they could not verify. Some described hearing whispers that were not words but patterns, shapes of thought repeating like multiplication tables. In room 8, the wall clock had stopped, not from age or disuse, but from being wound too tightly. The mainspring had snapped clean in half, slicing into the brass housing like a blade. The copper sheets beneath the desks had turned green, and several of the Leyden jars had fused at the base. Their contents were inert, but when held, they hummed slightly in the palm. Not mechanical, not electric, a memory hum, a rhythm without source. The most disturbing finds were not physical. They were sensory. One crew opened the back stairwell, long sealed, and found the air inside warmer than expected. Not mold warm, skin warm, breathing warm. And it smelled faintly of pressed wool, old apples, and something that made one man begin crying without knowing why. He couldn't stop for 2 hours. The smell followed him home. Under the east hallway, they uncovered sealed tiles, each a square foot wide, covered in soot-black glaze, arranged in a pattern no one recognized but everyone instinctively avoided. When a boy stepped on one, his ears bled lightly for half an hour. No pain, just a slow pink seep, as if something old had finally found a way out. At the rear of the building, near what had once been the still room, they found a cavity behind the bricks, a kind of open lung. Inside, bones. Not human, not animal. Long, hollow things with smooth curves and no clear point of origin. They were laid in a spiral, gently blackened, each bound in twine and marked with numbers. The paper tags had faded. The shape remained. Throughout it all, no one found what they were looking for. No bodies, no weapons, no declaration of guilt. Redgate had kept its story clean. But the smell of iron, the slick film on the tongue, the frost that returned to the floorboards even after torching, these were not deniable. The school had taught something beyond reading and song. It had recorded something in the material, not events, not crimes, but processes, repetitions, sacrifices of pattern, not blood. And the people who pulled open its ribs began to feel it, that this was not evidence. It was instruction. One father stood at the rain spot, now exposed as a circle of scorched limestone beneath the waxed pine. He stared down for a full minute before saying it wasn't hiding. He said it like a confession, like an apology, and the room stayed quiet as if waiting for permission to resume. Outside, the church bell rang. The real one. The one that had always marked weddings, deaths, and school openings. It rang once, unprompted. By the time dusk fell, the building had been half dismantled. Planks stacked, tools laid down, but no one looked relieved. The teachers were gone, the records silent, the halls empty. But Redgate was still intact in the way that mattered. Its design had been revealed. And what it revealed was not madness. It was purpose. Not everyone returned the next day. Some who had pulled the boards now woke with tremors. Others slept through alarms. A few couldn't sleep at all. But they all spoke of the same thing. How the quiet had changed. How silence now came in beats. How their breath caught just before falling asleep. The school had been opened. Its insides emptied. Its rituals scattered. But the structure, what it had taught, what it had reshaped, had not died. It had escaped, quietly, through those who had touched it. And now, the only question left was what Redgate had made, and whether it could be undone. And so now, a bell rests behind glass. A law bears its name. A school is gone, but its rhythm still echoes in people who don't realize they're still walking the paths it carved into their bodies. Every breath they hold too long, every apology given too early, every kindness offered in place of truth. So now all that remains is the question. One that no legislation, no archive, no memorial can answer. What do you think? Could this happen again? Behind polite books and clean rooms? behind soft words and steady hands? Would we even know it if it already had?